sun.
Ages and the increasing firepower of artillery forced a change of attitude towards the use of the horse in war. By the 17th century, new cavalry tactics using lighter, better quality horses began to emerge. Light cavalry had now become essential to the defense of Eastern Europe against the martial might of Islam. The rise of the Turkish Empire was based upon the effectiveness of their light cavalry and the inspiration of the Islamic faith. Having finally overwhelmed the Byzantine Empire in 1493, the Turks advanced steadily through the Balkans, while their ships spread the power of the Ottoman Empire along the coastlines of the Mediterranean. Constant wars between Turk and Magyar raged over Hungarian soil for the next 150 years, so that while in the western half of Europe the population doubled, in Hungary and her neighboring states, the population was halved. Apart from the effect this had upon the balance of power in Europe, the successes of the Turkish army finally convinced the West of the advantages of light cavalry. At last, generals emerged who realized that the most effective use of cavalry was achieved by using the speed and mobility of the horse in precisely the same way as Mongols and Moors, Tartars and Turks had done. The first great cavalry general of this period, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, appeared to Western eyes as a great innovator, though many of his ideas reflected the tactics of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane in the 13th and 14th centuries. The precision and discipline of his cavalry was such that he was able to boast that 5,000 horsemen answered and responded when he moved his own reins. He employed the cavalry charge using pistols, but would only allow the front rank to fire them, except in special circumstances, preferring to exploit the initial shock with cold steel. To vary his tactics, Gustavus Adolphus would send his infantry in first to open up the enemy's front rank and follow through with the cavalry. Cromwell also adopted the initial use of the pistol and then followed through with the saber. Such was his control of his cavalry that, having defeated the royalist cavalry of Naseby, Cromwell, instead of pursuing the enemy from the field, stopped his men and turned them onto the royalist infantry. This move proved decisive, and his victory led to the loss of the whole of northern England to the royalist cause. It was the indiscipline of Prince Rupert's cavalry that diminished the effectiveness of the Cavaliers' dash and elan. After an initial success, the royalist horsemen could never be regrouped in time to play any further part in the major battles of the Civil War. Discipline was again the major element in the successes of arguably the greatest of the cavalry generals of this era. John Sobieski, who became King of Poland, totally reorganized his troops using light and heavy cavalry effectively together. The Polish hussars, carrying huge wings on their shoulders, created a terrifying sound which terrorized the Turks. In turning back the Turkish invaders from the gates of Vienna in 1683, Sobieski proved that, used correctly, cavalry could still play a vital role in world history. The ever-increasing firepower of both artillery and infantry, a major development was necessary if the horse was to continue to play an effective part in the European wars of the 18th and 19th centuries.
Frederick the Great had got the most perfect cavalry perhaps ever in history. They charged absolutely knee to knee, and they were very closely packed. They weren't allowed to have pistols or carbines. And the trouble with that was that in the middle of the 18th century, a very large number of new guns and new small arms had come into being, and they were a great threat to these massed cavalry charges. So he decided, why not let's have some light guns drawn by horses, which can come up with the cavalry, keeping pace with them, and pushing off the enemy's artillery and small arms so that they can then charge.
Galloping gunners' proud boast that wherever the cavalry went, they would go also. The mobility and precision which we see here, when translated to the field of battle, enabled Frederick's and succeeding armies to soften up enemy infantry in entrenched positions before sending in the cavalry. The constant European wars of the 18th century created the opportunity for the North American colonists to free themselves from the dominance of the Old World. But the ideas of personal freedom inherent in the American War of Independence also created the desire for change in Europe. In the turmoil which followed the French Revolution, the horse was again to play a major role, not least in thwarting Napoleon's tyrannical lust for power.
The cavalry played an enormous part in the Napoleonic Wars. There's no question about that. Very large numbers of cavalry regiments were employed by all the competent nations, but they were not always decisive. They were very good at pursuing, and sometimes, of course, they failed to pursue because their horses were too tired, which is a point which happened constantly in all battles. last great battle of the Napoleonic Wars, Waterloo. Here's a splendid painting by Dennis Dighton of that horrible battle. Here's the Duke of Wellington, incidentally. And there you see what it was like to be a cavalryman in those days. There's a Polish lancer in Napoleon's army. Here's a British hussar with his saber slashing away. Here's a poor horse dying, and this one looks as if it's not going to get much further. And incidentally, this is my great-great-grandfather, called the Earl of Uxbridge at that time, and he lost his leg at this battle. We've got his wooden leg, we've got his hat, and that sabretache is in the National Army Museum.
The War of American Independence had created the dynamic for a general opening up of the interior lands by the people of the new republic. Opening up of the West, the improvement in firearms, which had resulted from successive European wars, gave the settlers an overwhelming advantage over the North American Indians. By 1812, settlers were streaming west across Illinois, forcing the Indians back across the Mississippi.
Here at the National Cowboy Hall of Fame and Western Heritage Center in Oklahoma City, we've made a valiant effort to capture the history of the Old West, as well as the beauty and the great struggles that the pioneers had as they came to this part of the world with their families, and particularly with the horses that they used to break the land and work the cattle and make this into a civilized area.
This statue of an American Indian on a horse shows the full story of the American Plains Indian. The artist James Earl Frazier has captured within this one piece of art the story of the Plains Indian. We can see the drama in this statue. We can see the nobility that was out of the Plains Indian as he roamed the West and followed the great herds of buffalo, as he and his horse were really the lords of the plains. See the pathos and the dejection as the American Plains Indian came literally to the end of his trail, because his culture and his way of life had been destroyed by the Western movement of the white settlers.
Of North America, the horse had become essential to farmer and herdsman alike. Now, making full use of the wide open spaces, he was to play just as important a role in the American Civil War, the memory of which is still kept alive today in a variety of ways. Naturally, the South had the advantages of better horses and the tradition of dashing horsemanship, and this resulted in the Confederacy's early successes. But as this advantage was whittled away, the industrial muscle and the sea power of the North gradually prevailed.
Good job. My grandfather and his brothers took the horses off of this farm and went with their own horses. We had, maybe they had 12 or 15 horses on this farm. And then they did leave enough horses on the farm to keep farming so we could raise something for the South. And then we had an old man out there by the name of Sam Summers. He worked on the farm. He wasn't in the war. And he would bring the horses in when they'd see the Yankees a-coming. And the Yankees would steal anything they could get their hands on, even horses. They'd take it. And old Mr. Sam Summers would bring the horses when he heard the Yankees was a-coming. And he'd bring the horses in here to this house and hide them in that cellar, so the Yankees couldn't see them, or they'd have took the horses with them.
In terms of 20th century politics, the ultimate victory of the North was to have a major effect on European history. Equally important was the growing industrial might of the United States, and this industrial might was still, to a large extent, dependent upon a plentiful supply of horsepower. In Western Europe, the 17th century saw a rapid increase in the use of horses for agricultural and draft purposes. Breeders seeking to satisfy the demand for bigger and more powerful horses were able to draw as foundation stock on the descendants of the medieval war horse. Steady improvement in the roads and increasing wealth led also to a demand for more carriage and riding horses able to respond to a diversity of purposes. This, in turn, led to a great explosion of new types and breeds, each adapted to respond to certain special requirements. The invention of steam power seemed to challenge the dominance of the horse. Now, instead of depending on wind, water, man, or beast, almost unlimited power could be created anywhere in the world. This power to raise 550 pounds, 1 inch in 1 second, was measured as 1 horsepower. Far from being a threat to the dominance of the horse, steam power actually created an almost insatiable need for more and more horses. This may seem a little paradoxical, but steam power actually created heavy industry, and heavy industry needs a workforce, and the workforce has to be fed. Similarly, the machine itself needs raw materials and fuel. And finally, there are the manufactured goods that the machine produces. These have to be sent to all the various outlets. So we have the fuel, we have food, manufactured goods, and raw materials. And these have to be transported. And the best way to transport them was still to use the power of the horse. The development of new machinery able to do a variety of different jobs enabled the ever-growing demand for cheap food to be answered. The means to power these machines was the horse. In the Middle Ages, there was a saying, the ox saves food, the horse man-hours. Now, the accent was on speed, on the saving of man-hours rather than fodder. Not only was the horse an essential part of European agricultural life in the new industrial societies of the 19th century, but increasing demand for food reached the point where it could only be met by the opening up of new and often marginal lands. In these areas, the speed of the workhorse was crucial to the rapid production of more and more food. The opening up of the Midwest and the development of the entire United States economy reveals the importance of the horse. Between 1860 and the First World War, the number of horses in the United States rose from about 6 million to over 25 million. In response to the size of America, the ratio of horse to man had become 1 horse to every 3 people. In Britain, where distances were so much less, this ratio was 1 horse to every 12 people. By 1900, the American wheat acreage alone was 50% greater than the entire cultivated area of Great Britain.
The horse, through mechanization, enabled literally millions of acres of virgin land to be broken up for tillage and to harvest and to process the vast produce of the American prairies. In America, the success of American agriculture depended very heavily on mechanization. In the far west, in California, in the 1890s, huge combine harvesters weighing 15 tons, cutting swathes of corn 35 to 40 foot wide, and hauled by an army of 40 horses, were used extensively to cut the corn. Also, in the American prairies, about the same time, plows with 4 or 5 bottoms, hauled by 8 horses, would be used in the primary tillage. The American West, which became, of course, one of the greatest bread baskets in the world, owed a very great deal to the horse.
The concept of ranching, which had developed on these Spanish grasslands, was adapted by the colonists in North and South America to provide beef for the Old World. Here, the nomadic herdsman developed skills, which had originated in the bullring, to cut out steers or calves.
I'm going with the cow, thinking stop, wanting my mare to be straight. That's why I catch the rein on the offside there. Do it again. Make sure she turns straight. She should only move when the cow moves. No extra jumping around. Move, counter move. Move and counter move.
Herds to rivers and seaports, more horses were required. Far from diminishing the demands made on the horse, the coming of the railways actually increased it. The railhead, and from the railhead to and from the factories, an ever-increasing load of short-haul traffic depended on the horse. In the mines, on the canals, in the cities, and on the newly metalled highways, the power of the horse had become a necessity to such an extent that it's hard to believe that the Industrial Revolution could have come about without him.
I believe that every city, town and village in the industrialized world should erect a statue to the working horse. It seems that only pleasure horses and race horses have been so honored. And it's difficult, I think, to explain this neglect, except, of course, that the working horse may have been so much a part of the fabric of everyday life as to have been taken for granted. Horse numbers grew continuously throughout the 19th century and reached their peak soon after 1900, when the total national herd stood at 3.3 million horses. That is approximately 1 horse for every 12 people. They were employed for carriage work, for omnibus horses, van horses, as well as in general transport used by everybody from brewers to undertakers. In London, in the late 19th century, only about 1% of the horses there were used for riding purposes. Fully 99% were used in trade, commerce, or for drug purposes. By the end of the 19th century, something of a crisis had occurred in the towns with regard to the horses. There were complaints about mounting chaos in the streets, about congestion, about the breaking up of the roadways through the pounding of 300 weights of hooves, and not least the dirt. One interesting thought is that the average horse voids approximately 300 to 400 weights of dung a year, and by a simple calculation we can see that in London alone 500 to 600 million tons of dung per year had to be removed from the streets, and indeed the removal of it was a major industry all by itself. It is a very nice thought as to what would have happened to this country and to the industrialized world had the motor car not been invented. Would we have eventually been flooded out with horses? Would eventually we have come to compete with the horse for precious food? Because after all, it took 3 to 4 acres to feed a horse, and only half to 3/4 of an acre to feed a human being. A race, I wonder who would have won it.
The connection between John Sobieski's great victory at Vienna and the small Suffolk town of Newmarket, which the Stuart kings had established as the headquarters of modern horse racing, may at first seem obscure, but it was at Vienna that Captain Robert Byerley captured the first of the founding fathers of the English thoroughbred. The Byerley Turk, after carrying his master in the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, was retired to stud in County Durham and then to Goldsborough Hall in Yorkshire. From the Byerley Turk comes the bloodline which produced Herod, the Tetrarch, and Tourbillon. The second of the founding fathers of the thoroughbred was the Darley Arabian. The Darley Arabian was bought by Mr. Thomas Darley, the British consul in Syria, for 300 sovereigns. The Sheikh of Aleppo, however, refused to let the horse leave the royal stables on pain of death, so the resourceful Darley arranged for some British sailors at dead of night to take the horse from the royal stables and smuggle him aboard a British man of war. In vain did the Sheikh appeal to Queen Anne for the return of his stallion. Possession being 9 points of the law, Mr. Darley sent his stallion to stand at Aldbury Park in Yorkshire. The third and last of the founding stallions of the thoroughbred was the Godolphin Arabian. Sent as a present to King Louis XIV by the Bey of Tunis, he's rumoured to have been pulling a dust cart in Paris in 1729 when a Mr. Edward Coke bought him and brought him back to England to stand in Derbyshire. On Coke's death, the Earl of Godolphin bought the stallion and sent him to his stud near Newmarket. To these 3 stallions, all modern thoroughbreds can be traced. Initially, racing consisted mostly of matches between 2 mature horses and were tests of endurance, usually ridden over 4 miles of open ground. As racing became more organized, regulations were needed, and records of race results and pedigrees kept.
In due course, the Jockey Club assumed the role as governors of the sport here at Newmarket and ultimately throughout the United Kingdom. Originally, racing was very much a matter of testing the endurance of the mature horse. 4 miles, sometimes even 6. The finest horse of this era was Eclipse, a direct male line descendant of the Darley Arabian, foaled in 1764. He was bred by a royal duke, the Duke of Cumberland, and was never beaten in 20 races. When he retired to stud, he became an outstanding sire, and today, 200 years on, there is not a single thoroughbred in the world who cannot trace his pedigree to Eclipse. The introduction of the classic races for 3-year-olds towards the end of the 18th and at the beginning of the 19th centuries was crucial to the development of the breed. By the 1890s, the notion of the model thoroughbred was typified by Persimmon, a horse capable of producing top-class form from 6 furlongs to 2.5 miles at 2 to 4 years. Persimmon, who was bred by the Prince of Wales, who became King Edward VII, won prestige races over 6 furlongs at Ascot and Goodwood as a 2-year-old, the Derby at 1.5 miles, and the St. Leger at 1 3/4 as a 3-year-old, and as a 4-year-old, the Ascot Gold Cup over 2.5 miles. Such versatility is rare today. Indeed, since Persimmon, no horse has matched his achievements over such a time span and over such a wide variety of distances.
Just as racing had been a part of man's history from time immemorial, so also had hunting. A primitive instinct was answered by the chase, and from the earliest days of horsemanship, continued uninterrupted long after it had ceased to be a necessity for survival. Even the most sophisticated societies had found pleasure in a sport in which man was raised in the image of war, without its guilt and only 25% of its danger. By the early 1700s in England, the enclosing of common lands, the reduction of forest areas, and the greatly increased quality and speed of the horses available led to the general introduction of fox hunting in the place of the pursuit of the deer.
And we kill very few foxes in the season. It's very difficult to kill a fox. He's a very clever animal, and it's up to the huntsman to pit his wits against the fox's wits in the countryside. And the fox knows the countryside far better than I do or any huntsman does. And it's a terrific challenge, both for him and for me. I see it as traditional country sport to be enjoyed by everybody, not just by the people on horseback, that like to view the likes of everybody else through the country, whether they are farmers, city people who want to come out in cars or whatever. It's a sport for everybody. The Irish horse is one of the most clever, courageous and brave horses in the world. They're natural jumpers, and they revel in hunting. They love hunting. We've all had falls. If I don't get a fall about once a fortnight, I begin to think there's something wrong, because we're accustomed to falling. Most of us have been to hospital with various reasons for breaking bones and so on. This is all part of the game. It's a challenge, and this, I think, is what, especially the younger generation nowadays, this is the sort of satisfaction they can get by coming hunting. They fulfill some sort of natural instinct in doing something brave, something really taxing.
The spread of fox hunting developed an awareness of the countryside, and consequently a desire to preserve it. Also, a need arose for a certain type of horse, one that could gallop quite some distance at quite some speed and take on any obstacle in his path. This naturally appealed to man's competitive spirit, and soon he began to compete, one hunter against another. This was the beginning of national hunt racing as we know it today.
The sport of steeplechasing initially developed from 2-horse matches raced over natural country, from church steeple to church steeple. As the sport became established, larger fields appeared, and several races were held over the chosen course at each meeting. The first Grand National was won by a horse called Lottery in 1839. During the race, a Captain Beecher fell into a brook.
This is Red Rum, arguably the greatest entry horse of all time, who started his career as a very moderate flat horse, winning a 2-year-old seller at Liverpool before moving on to triumph over these big fences. And he is an indication that points of view about stature and physique, which make national hunt horses may be a purely subjective thing, because he is typically a very athletic, robust, flat racing type of horse, but he has that essential spark that makes the racehorse the competitive spirit.
By 1842, 66 meetings were held annually, including the Cheltenham Grand Annual, which was already well established. The sport became more organised after 1866, when the National Hunt Committee was formed. This was the golden age of the great Corinthians, when amateur jockeys dominated the sport, and by the end of the century, steeplechasing had established as devoted a following as had racing on the flat.
Here at the Irish National Stud, that's just one of many thoroughbred stallions which we stand here, covering Irish mares in the main. Ireland, going back 200 or 300 years, saw very early that there was a real need for a large number of horses. There was an export market to England, to the continent, to America, and the Irish horse filled the need perfectly. There are a number of reasons for this. The climate that we have here is conducive to the breeding of good horses. The limestone land is great for growing bone, and that made great chargers, great work horses, and indeed in more modern days, marvellous race horses.
Connemara ponies, the history of them goes back to a very early time in Connemara. Every small farmer in Connemara had a pony in their little holding, and it was their sole way of transport. The Department of Agriculture formed the Connemara Pony Society, and that has existed up to this present day. And they then had stallions, the property of the society, who were leased out to these men, and men in different areas took a Connemara pony stallion, and on a market day and fair days they got on their bicycle, took them by the head with a head collar, and they travelled to the different areas. The pony that would be in Ballyconneely would go to Roundstone, say, on a Tuesday, and then he'd be in Clifton on a Thursday. And they'd bring the mares into those areas to be covered. And they only were brought in once, and they had a much higher fertility rate than they have today, where everything has gone so scientific. Well, there is kind of a romantic fairy tale that, you know, when they came in off the ships into Galway and that there came in Bobs and Arabs, survivals from these ships that came in, stallions and that, spread around through Connemara and mated with the native mares. There is a slight tendency in some of the ponies that you will see a slight look of an Arab. You know, when they're trotting and that, sometimes the way they'll carry their tails.
But the most important thing of all in the making of the Irish horse, which is, of course, the best in the world by far, is the people who work those horses. The Irish people have a natural ability to handle horses, something that you don't make a horseman. They are horsemen. They breed. We breed horsemen. We don't make them here in Ireland. And in fact, even abroad in America and England and all the countries worldwide, the Irish people who are working there, they are the ones that people want, because they have this tremendous ability to get on with horses, to know horses, to understand them, and to work them. So, going back over the last 200 or 300 years, those three advantages have made the Irish horse what it is today, number one worldwide.
Keep an even pace, that's it. The rhythm and the pace is most important. That's it. Well, I suppose I've been very lucky, really, with all the good horses that I've either ridden or bred or that have passed through my hands. I suppose the best horse I ever bred was the first horse I ever bred, which was a horse called Easter Light. Raimondo Dinzeo, who rode him. And he won, I think, probably as many international competitions as any horse until Boomerang. And of course, Boomerang, as you probably know, was the best horse Eddie Mackin ever had. Now, I didn't breed him, but he did start his competitive career with me. And, well, I think Eddie will say that he was the best horse that he ever rode or owned or had anything to do with. So, what common denominator do they have? They were all Irish. And of course, I think that the Irish horses are the best in the world.
Just as the Greek and Roman empires in their heyday had expressed their cultures in the artistic form of the horse, so now the British Empire, at the height of its power, saw an explosion of artistic talent expressing itself in praise of the horse. In the United States, painters like Catlin and Remington, in capturing the rawness of life in the Wild West, helped to create a series of histories and romances for the New World, every bit as evocative as were the tales of courtly knights in the Old. Generally accepted as the founder of modern sporting art, George Stubbs created a style which portrays the living individuals. Stating that nature is and always will be superior to art, Stubbs had embarked upon an intense study of the anatomy of the horse before producing, in 1766, his book on the subject.
Now, how could an artist resist painting a horse like this? This is a maestro who's an American Morgan horse. I was brought up with horses, and I've never found anything to compare with them. I really genuinely love them. I mean, look at that eye. Look at that eye. How could you resist that as an artist? The horse has been a subject that the artist has wanted to capture for thousands of years. Not just in oil, which I'm doing, but all sorts of mediums, going back to as far as 5th century BC. I mean, here we have a horse, this was on the Parthenon, which is absolutely perfect to me. I mean, look, his round eye, and, okay, that's a bit broken now, but you couldn't fault that, really. And then, in bronze, here we have a stallion and a mare by the French men. I've always loved that. He was a wonderful sculptor. And look, even you get this perfect form, but you also get the emotion of the stallion and the mare there. And then we go to modern days. We have John Skeeping, who's also a very good painter. This is rather an early one of his, but it has marvellous simplicity. And he's captured all the movement of the gaucher. They say a man would rather have his horse painted than his wife. My answer to that is that I've never been asked to paint a wife by a man who owns horses. Stubbs taught me to paint. Well, I say taught, he's still teaching. I still go and study his paintings very carefully because you can learn so much from looking very carefully and very closely at a painting. And see the technique, and to me, there's no one to touch him for this classical technique. for painting the horse. One of my favourite paintings of Stubbs was a horse called Whistle Jacket. Originally, Stubbs painted the horse, and there was going to be the best portrait painter of the time to paint King George III on him, and the best landscape painter was going to paint the background. But after, I'm not sure who commissioned it, whoever it was saw it and thought it was so beautiful as it was that neither the portrait or the landscape was ever painted. I've painted quite a few different animals, including a cheetah, which is supposed to be one of the most beautiful animals in the world, but to me, there's nothing like a horse.
With a few notable exceptions, women's involvement with the horse had, from the earliest times, been restricted to sport and travel, and even this involvement virtually ceased during the Middle Ages. But the Renaissance saw the re-emergence of women in the hunting field. Women like Catherine de Medici, Queen Elizabeth I of England, Mary Queen of Scots, and Princess Juana of Spain. A major factor, in Europe at least, was the development of the side saddle.
These type of saddles, as opposed to simply sitting sideways on a man saddle, evolved probably from the pack saddle in the early 16th century. We've got rather an interesting history as to how these pommels came about. Initially, Elizabeth I rode side saddle with simply one central pommel, rather like a western saddle. Shortly after her, Catherine of Medici fell off rather a lot out hunting and decided to move the central pommel to here, where she could get her leg round and feel a bit more secure. It wasn't until the early 19th century that Pellier produced this here, the leaping head, to tuck the other leg under when in stress. Now, one of the most difficult things riding side saddle, apart from getting off, apparently is the even distribution of weight. And I think maybe we should just watch now somebody who knows what they're doing and who is dressed appropriately.
The speed of fox hunting and the need to jump inhibited the use of the side saddle. In fact, in Victorian England, it was generally assumed that only fast women appeared in the hunting field. In his descriptive novels of the social and hunting scene of that period, Robert Surtees only depicted one woman as really going in the hunting field, and even of this heroine, Lucy Glitters, he wrote that she was beautiful and tolerably virtuous. In real life, one of the women who really went across the country was Skittles, one of the most attractive Victorian courtesans. On one occasion, a master of foxhounds, on instructions from his wife, sent Skittles home, causing her to remark, "I don't see why Lady Stamford objects to me. She's not even head of our profession. Lady Cardigan is." Now, at the end of the Victorian era, there were to be two revolutionary developments, one in the style of riding, and the other in the invention of a new sort of horsepower, the horseless carriage or motor car.